Hello, everyone. You're joining me, Jason Hsu, the founder and curator of TedEXTaipei and TEDx ambassador, with Mr. Charles Landry. Hi, Charles.
Hi, how are you
Good to
doing,
see you.
Jason?
大家午安，我是TEDx 台北策展人许玉仁。今天跟我一起在接下来的1个小时，跟远来自英国的 Charles Landry 聊一聊创意城市。Let me begin by introducing Charles a little bit. He's an old dear friend. I call him Charles. Charles is the founder of Comedia, and he's been looking at cities from innovation point of view, from creativity, from co-creation, and from hard thinking and soft thinking. And really, he is the embodiment of intersection or the crossover of creativity and business education. And with that, let's welcome Charles. Charles, first, tell us what got you here. Did you get on a wrong plane? You were going to Thailand and you end up in Taiwan. And I know it's not the first time you've been here, coming here regularly over the last 3 years. So what got you here in the first place?
Well, in fact, what got me here originally was being a private visitor, a traveller. I read in a book, The Lonely Planet, a long time ago, and it said, Taipei, this is a really ugly place. It's got a national museum, and I thought, yes, this ugly place is for me. And then when I came here, this was probably 15 years ago, there was a bit of an earthquake happening, and I just felt Taipei is what it is. It's unpretentious. So at one level, that's one of my main words. You know, it's just authentic. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. And I really liked that sort of fusion of different aspects of the Chinese, which felt to me quite rich. So I was always in principle sympathetic. And then Margaret Chiu from Bamboo Curtain, she got one of my books translated into Chinese, which was called The Creative City. And that then led the Urban Regeneration Organization, someone called Jia Lin, to say, well, would I be involved in the city, thinking through with them where Taipei is and where Taipei might be going?
That's very exciting. So it looks like you've come here with a mission to explore Taipei, and now you've actually met a group of friends that, you know, sort of becoming the treasure that you found here in Taipei. And I know for the last 3 years you've published 2 books, and today you're actually launching a 3rd book. The last books are Talented Taipei and A Creative Imperative. In these 2 books that you made vivid observation of Taipei as a creative city. And today, your book is Taipei, a City of Ambition. I want to begin by asking you what led you to write down this title. What do you mean by a City of Ambition? And tell us about your book.
Well, it's interesting because the title, City of Ambition, relates to the 2 titles before. So, to be a city that has ambition, in my view, you need to harness the collective imagination, which was part of the title of the 2nd book. And in order to harness the collective imagination, you also need to value all the talents you have. So all of the 3 books hang together. The first, perhaps, was a diagnosis from an external perspective, and I've always seen myself more as a critical friend, collaborating with people in Taipei, a sort of diagnosis of what for me, the central issue was, which was the fact that there's a lot of talented potential here, but perhaps it's not brought together enough, which was what we were describing very much in the 2nd book. The ambition point is really then saying, well, it's all very well having talent, but you need to be going somewhere. It needs to have a direction. It needs to have a story of something that pushes people to go beyond where they already are. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, we can do it. I think it says somewhere here at the back, Taipei city making, we can. And that's one of the main messages, that it is possible, we are able, but there are a lot of barriers. And in the former two books, I described some of these barriers. One of them is a sort of administrative structure that is a bit old-fashioned. And in one of the books I also described, because I was making it very simplistic, the city 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. The 1.0 city is all about hardware, hierarchical, you just do what you're told. The construction industry is the most important thing. The 2.0 city is more concerned about the software, hardware, urban design, other issues. It's probably not the factory that's important, it's the science part. But the 3.0 city, which I think is evolving in the world, and this is the ambition I think that I'm talking about, is the one that co-creates with its citizens, is clever in the way it thinks about things, has administrative government structure that is enabling rather than controlling. So it's the ambition part of this city is a city where people can fulfill the potential that they have. That's the ambition.
So I want to go deeper into the part of ambition. What role can government play, or what role they shouldn't play? And how does every ordinary citizen be part of it?
Again, everything happens in context. We all know that the way the city works, the way the world works, the economy works, is very different than before. We are both users and producers at the same time. We know about digital culture. We know about the potential of all the new media and all of that. Now that sets a real challenge for a government. Governments in some countries are quite rigid and inflexible. And so the role of government here is firstly to understand these dramatic shifts. Secondly, to adapt from being a more controlling entity to a more enabling entity. Now, of course, that's very easy to say, but difficult to do. So that's point one, and to try and adjust the rules and regulations to more you can rather than you cannot.
Now, talking about your idea of 3.0, I think it's almost like a bottom-up, participatory movement. And, in recent election, our online social media, social community have played a big role in, addressing the issue of change of leadership. And now with the new mayor in office, do you believe that social media or social community in this regard play an important role in the Creative City 3.0? And that also means power to the people. What is your role in this? And because when we talk about city, we still think about structure, we still think about infrastructure, buildings, roads, and stuff like that. But how does every single person can be more empowered to this, or as an enabler?
Well, in the 1.0 city, people think, let's build the infrastructure and the people will come in later. In the 3.0 city, it's more like, okay, how can you make the most of people's potential? And what is then the infrastructure we need for that? Which is a very different approach. Now, my view is that any city should have many, many, many leaders. Now, let's say Taipei is 3 million people for the sake of argument. So if only 1% of people could be defined as leaders, that I think is already 30,000, and that's only taking 1%. Now I think we know from many of the areas in new technology, when you throw out a problem, for example, the online tech community often solves it together cheaper than in traditional ways. Now, there are hundreds of ways in which the users, the citizens, have the solutions in their own, in theory, in their own mind. They know what is to be done. But there are obstacles in them implementing that. So in a funny way, it's obvious in the sense that it's much more effective. It sometimes can cost less, although sometimes it might take initially more time. So there's a balance between, you know, some people think all this consultation by definition makes things more complex. Well, yes and no.
And also, you've also stressed the point of a open structure and really open communication and understanding between the government and people. And now we actually had, there's a list of questions that we collected from online, and one of the, I think, burning questions that people are asking is, you know, how do we really carry on a trusting relationship with the government? Because right now we're seeing a crisis between general public and the governing institution. You know, how do we even say we entrust our city to them, and you know, what would be?
Well, I mean, what's happened in my view from an external perspective, and I'm trying to be, as I said earlier, a critical friend to Taipei, is there has not been a mature relationship between the different partners, which could be the private, the public, the community in some sense. And because of that, trust has broken down. And I think what this process of opening out is about is trying to regain trust, trying to begin to open out the conversations again. But that means both parties have to change. You can't regain trust if the government remains sort of rigid and is more, you can't do this, you can't do that. And let's say the private sector is only interested in their own self-interest. So we've got to find a way where public and private interest again blends together for the bigger purpose of the future of Taipei. Of course, when you begin that step of re-establishing trust, it's not easy. So the best way to do it is to begin to experiment, is to begin to do projects. So for example, the World Design Capital, which is for 2016, could be, for example, a platform for saying, let's do things slightly differently. We've got a target, 2016, here are some projects. Let's try and do them in a different way and see if we can learn from them.
Yeah. Now let's talk about World Design Capital. You know, it's coming up. It's next year, and obviously Taipei is anticipating this big recognition. But I wanted to ask you, what is the legacy? You know, what should we leave behind after we throw a big celebration? How do Taipei, from a city point of view, really make sure this is not just the name that we are gaining, but it's more a movement that will steer the city to be for a better tomorrow?
Well, people now with big projects, World Design Capital, Olympics, European Capital of Culture, and all of that, are in the conception of the projects already thinking about the legacy. So the first thing is obviously to conceive the projects in such a way that they're not seen as one-off events, that they, for example, develop processes that continue. Now, the World Design Capital can test some processes, because not everything is successful, obviously, which then become embedded. That could become a legacy, i.e. having co-designed, let's say, public space together, having co-designed services together, you know, not treating you as a client, but you as a co-producer with me who perhaps provides funding. And one of the reasons why that's very important is, if I was a private company, you would say to me, what is your research and development department? Have you got one? And if I said no, you'd say, are you stupid? You've got to continually be testing new ideas. And for the city, it needs a mechanism for that as well. Because what's the problem with rigid organizational structures, it's as if you have to have the right solution immediately. But we never have the right solution immediately. We're always adapting solutions in order to respond to things as they move along. So in relation to the World Design Capital thing, it's to really think of some difficult problems that Taipei's wanted to solve and to test out solutions in that year.
For example, what would be some of the difficult problems you?
Well, a difficult problem might be a neighborhood which is really rather poor, people are under ambitious, have no aspiration. How can we find ways of lifting the aspiration of people who are undereducated, feel depressed? That's a sort of typical difficult problem. So what could we do to lift their aspiration would be an example. Another example could be, how can we get projects to work where you bring in a new way of looking at buildings that look incredibly green but look different and feel different. You could test that out, for example. A new form of housing or something like that.
Now, you've coined the term creative cities in 30 years ago. And have you seen a change in the definition of creative cities in maybe last decade? And how would the idea of creative cities be adapted to a city like Taipei?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I initially coined the term in the late 80s was because there was a dramatic shift in the economy happening in Europe, and we were saying that culture, both the cultural industries, the creative industries, those sectors like design, film, music, etc., were important sectors, but also that culture was very good as providing image value, symbolic value, and identity value for a city, and that it was a resource. And so that was very 2.0 in a sense, saying this is a neglected resource. Initially, I looked at in a more limited way when I started the first project called the Creative City in Glasgow, which looked at the creative economy sectors. But then quite rapidly I realized, unless the whole ecosystem is quite open and imaginative, then you can't really have a bit of imagination in that corner here and everything is horrible over here. That doesn't really make a creative city. So I then began to look at the creative ecology of a city as a totality, which got me into areas like business development, administration, planning law, all sorts of things like that. And I think what's changed in terms of the definition of the creative city is initially there was more of a focus on the arts, whereas now it's broader. Now, what I do think is very important about the arts, more narrowly defined culture, is of course incredibly interesting for many reasons. And particularly it's good if planners and others think in a more artistic way and so on. I think that's really very, very important. But the main shift has been to say, what is the purpose of creativity? I'm much more concerned now, what is the purpose? And my feeling nowadays is the purpose is to address issues that really matter. And issues that really matter, in a general level, is obviously climate change issues. At a more specific level in Taipei, it may be to do with the outflow of talent. But to say, how can I use my imagination so people can think, plan, and act creatively, but in order to solve problems or generate opportunities? So I broadened out the scope of action within which creativity can fall. So that's the main difference. There's another difference, because I think you all know Richard Florida wrote a book called
Creative Class.
The Creative Class, and we discussed that earlier. And the difference between what I've been doing and he was doing, he in the year 2002 brought that book out, which initially I thought was very interesting. I still think it's interesting. Lots of people, like everything, we all people criticize things. But he did make an important point, which was about talent, tolerance, and technology. But the difference is really, for me, it's not about a class, a grouping that is creative. I'm always looking, how can everybody give more of what they've got? Which is why quite often why I mentioned, for example, in book 2, the title said, The Creativity Platform for Taipei, Harnessing the Collective Imagination. Because a place that is relatively small, and you live under the shadow of China and other places, you've got to use as much as your potential as possible, since they've got 50 times as much population.
Exactly. You've worked with several countries and cities, and you've kind of, in your first-hand experience, watched and understood and also helped change some of the best practices in the cities. For example, in Australia. What are some of the good examples that you can share with us that in your recent observations of a city or cities that are doing great stuff?
Well, last September, many of us were involved in an event we co-organized with Bamboo Curtain International and others, which was really about being smart citizens, entrepreneurship, clever governance. And we decided to bring 3 cities to come to Taipei for 3 different reasons. And we brought Adelaide because Adelaide suffers relatively to Melbourne and Sydney. And so they said, well, one of the few resources we've got is to be very clever in how we govern ourselves. That's our resource. If we can govern ourselves well, then we're saving money effectively. So the Premier said, and he gave this lady called Irma Raineri the power to try and solve difficult problems. And she invented this idea of the 90-day project, where you had to solve a problem, domestic violence or whatever it was, difficult issues, in 90 days. And one of the main lessons from that project, which she has done, or they have done, I think 30 or 40, was the solution normally was banging heads together. So, for example, in the case of domestic violence, because only one department looked at it, the police, but not social services, education, economics, and so on, often they couldn't read what the situation was. But when they set up an office where all of these people were sitting together, they began to solve these types of problems. So that was cross-departmental working lesson 1. That lesson was reinforced recently when I was interviewing cities for this City of Ambition thing. And I asked Barcelona, which is one of the most admired cities, can you tell me what is the one or second thing you could say that you've learned from all your experience? And one of their leaders said, there's only one thing, break the silo. If you can't collectively collaborate and bring joint thinking together, jointly trying to solve the problem, then you get nowhere. And he said that what we try to learn to do, and it's not easy, of course, is to constantly say, how can we together solve the problem, rather than saying, I'm Department X, these are my rules, but always looking at the problem. How can you change the rules to solve the problem, rather than saying, I can't solve the problem because of the rules? So that was one example. Another example we brought in, if I can give these two examples, is Rotterdam, where we were really discussing how do you create hubs? How do you create and bring life to these old buildings? We're in Huashan now. How would you fill this with people who are all active and want to connect? And the person who came there, Leo van Loon, set up a network of all of these hubs around the Netherlands, which had 4,000 small companies. And what he's done, and I think this is good, is created a sort of learning environment where you could both lobby, get tax changes and so on. The third example, which I find really significant and is difficult, was we brought someone from Helsinki who was relevant for 2 reasons. One was to do with open data and sharing open data, but the other was to do with procurement. And procurement is an incredibly
complex issue. Yeah.
And I'm not the world specialist in procurement, but all I know is that procurement that says, for example, the cheapest price wins, and then you don't get quality in a building, for example, or rather than trying to make a judgment about who we employ. So, for example, what they have tried to do in Finland is use the fact that the public sector needs services to help small companies develop services, which then solves the service problem and invents a new one, but also at the same time creates new companies. So they've used procurement as a mechanism to, in a sense, foster startup culture. And I remember the first time I went to Barcelona in the late 70s, I went into the office of the cultural department. This is a long time ago, yeah. And I saw all this amazing furniture. And they said, oh, we buy this furniture for all our offices because that helps the small companies who make the furniture. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So procurement is a really serious issue, but also such a powerful lever to really strengthen the innovation ecosystem.
Have you met our new mayor? Have you got a chance to meet him yet?
No, I haven't met him, but I've heard about him.
I bet you two will get along very well.
But he's a bit surgical, isn't he? He's
exactly.
so fast. I don't think I can keep up with him.
That actually leads to the next question I want to ask you, because Mayor Ko, he's a medical surgeon.
Yeah.
Everything is about effectiveness and efficiency.
Yeah.
He has a famous quote: "Is use a number to convince me." There's no emotion, and there's not much personal attachment to it. What was some of the advices you would give him if you get a chance to see him?
Well, I mean,
you met him.
I met the vice mayor today,
the top lieutenant,
and so on. So I've met some of the new people in the political structure. I mean, while I appreciate that you want to change things, you want to do things fast, I also think you need some thinking time within it. So certainly think before you act rather than act before you think. So there's a balance between speed and slowness. That's not to say keep things slow forever, but just make sure that as you're acting quickly, you have really thought things through. And also, whilst you're creating ambitious targets, don't try to do everything at once simultaneously, because you want to learn from doing. So, for example, in terms of urban development, the problem about Dubai, as an example, everything was built so quickly at once that it already things that you should have done differently you haven't done because you've already finished it. So think about the organic process. So that would be one piece of advice.
Interesting that you mentioned the idea of organic process. I think organic sometimes also means democratic, because you allow it to sort of happen and decided by the people.
Yeah.
But what about effectiveness? How would you strike a balance? What would be the best way to say, I want to get this done, but get it done in the power of people?
Well, we touched upon earlier the thing about the World Design Capital. One of the good ways of balancing effectiveness and consultation, certainly in Europe, has been having these targets, yeah? Because the target means you have to deliver by a certain point. And usually these big programs have been created through public consultation because you want to gather in ideas. Now, so that is one good mechanism. Another good mechanism, I think, is award systems. Around the world, there are an increasing number of awards, like the Knight Foundation in Miami has a Challenge Award about innovation, the Bloomberg Award for Innovation, the European Capital of Innovation Award, which is trying to get people to come up with things they think they've done well and to give prizes. Now that's of course not the same as actually generalized public consultation on everything, but you know, it all depends what you mean by consultation and being involving the citizens, because you know, all the new mechanisms like TripAdvisor, Booking.com, Airbnb, Uber taxis, all of these things are consulting, because you give your feedback all the time in a constant feedback loop. So I think we have to be quite careful about, there are many forms and many ways of consulting, and I don't think everybody all the time wants to be consulted about everything in detail. So I just think one has to be quite specific where we consult and when we consult. One project style I really like, which exists, which is participatory budgeting, which I think there are some examples in Taipei, I'm not sure, but there are a couple of cities around the world that do it well, Reggio Emilia, Belo Horizonte in Brazil, where you say, okay, this is the budget, this is your area, we've got these plans, they cost 200 NT, but we've only got 100 NT, we want them all, you help us decide which of these we're going to do. And I think that's, for example, a good way of participation.
Now, I wanted to kind of get into the topic of big corporate. What is, you know, people in Taipei complain about rising property price? You know, if you look at today's young generation, they could be working their entire lives without, you know, being able to buy a apartment unit. And this has happened in my parents' generation, but this and yet has become a common situation now in Taipei. Where should developer, you know, their responsibility lies when, you know, when we talk about a sustainable economy, when we talk about a harmonious society, or when we talk about a happy family? You know, if nobody can afford to own or even to have or insured a peaceful place to live, then, you know, all this creative city is kind of a nonsense, right? So what are some of the examples that you would?
This is a global phenomenon. It is impossible for a young person, unless they've got rich parents, to buy somewhere in London. So it's a global phenomenon. We know the rich are getting richer, the poor poorer. The top 1% of the world own the equivalent of the bottom 50%. We've just seen these statistics come out of the Davos summit, which is just happening at the moment. But it's got worse and worse and worse. And and yesterday Obama again said we've got to redistribute wealth and so on. So there's a global movement really trying to tackle this problem. Now, if you have development processes which are land value driven, you will automatically have this problem. And in this book we describe very much how you need to look at the city as a project and look at capital in a comprehensive way. So for example, if you build a building which makes profit individually but reduces social capital and creativity capital because people have to travel 2 hours to get there, then it hasn't made money because it's lost money in the bigger sense of accounting. Now the way to deal with that, and again it's difficult, is obviously you insert social housing within high value properties in order to reduce the prices, or you have all sorts of taxation means about speculation and so on. So there's no doubt that the current planning systems and taxation systems don't address that radically enough. So one has to do it from the taxation point of view, the planning point of view, but then also a social philosophy, ideology point of view, which is related to fairness. So you've got to hit it from many angles simultaneously. And I think, for example, in Taipei, one of the problems about rising property values is it misguides development. It therefore reduces the capacity of Taipei and Taiwan to be prosperous because not enough investment is going into companies and all of that. So there's the market is giving completely wrong signals about the things that are important. And that needs to be more publicly known. But of course there are developers, and they exist in Taipei too, these are the special developers, who understand that, who are willing to take less of a profit, but in a sense in the longer term gain more because what they're creating is a vibrant community and so on.
And I think that would be in a perfect world that would happen. But in most of the times, humans are driven by greed. I wonder what's the government's intervention should be in the situation you're talking about to balance it out.
Well, I mean, the way governments try to do that is, for example, saying you have to, in this development, have a certain percentage of it which is affordable, is one of the very simple ways that people do it, which is quite crude. It's a bit like a hammer, which says this is the way it's done. And there are examples of that. In London you can't build, or in Germany you can't build unless you also provide these other forms of housing. And then you get quite complicated regulations about can the person later on make a profit if they're buying something at reduced rent. But there are mechanisms to do that if we look at the different experiments that have been done. I mean, obviously I agree with you. If you can suddenly see a profit, of course you will try to make that profit. But this is where, quite often, if we say New York and Central Park, of course it would be easier to make a bit of money by just building on Central Park. Yeah. But at some point, the public interest said, let's have Central Park.
Now, in your second book, or I think it was the first book about a talented city, Taipei, in the recent survey published by Oxford Economics, it actually says Taiwan will be the most globally talent-drained country in the year 2025, which is less than 10 years. But we're still optimistic about the potential of the city. In your own view, what are some of the things that we could do to make Taipei really an attractive spot for a transnational talent to be, looking to work and live and reside in Taipei? What are some of the things that you would give to our current administration? Their immigration policy, their talent cultivation policy.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, we know that in general that many of the people who migrate to countries are ambitious and quite entrepreneurial because it takes quite an effort to migrate. You've got to take a risk. You've got to be courageous. It's an effort and all of that. So in general, I think we know that there is quite a strong contribution from that. So Taipei is only going to really work well if there's a good in and outflow of talent. Now, Forward Taiwan, as we know, is doing something about that, and I think that's very, very significant. I mean, I saw in an Arctic city 10 days ago, up in the north in the Arctic, a small place called Umeå. I was at an event like this, and there was a Croatian entrepreneur who'd fallen in love with a woman who lives in the ice and the snow. He'd set up one of the most successful Swedish internet-based companies, and on Fridays at lunchtime he always allows young people to present. So he's from Croatia. There were two 16-year-old boys who have revised the Apple Map app, and one was from China and one was from Sweden. So we have here a Croatian, a Chinese and a Swedish person, two of whom are 16, who is developing applications. And partly is because, of course, the different minds that are working. the Chinese guy and the Swedish guy, you can imagine wayfinding was an ideal app for them, giving Chinese characters and European linear writing. Yeah? So it wasn't surprising that they were developing a new version of Google Maps, and they were 16. Sorry,
they're from different countries.
That's why I'm saying that, and so that is absolutely a real precondition. Unless the immigration situation is made easier, then there won't be this in and outflow, which we need. People need to leave Taipei and Taiwan, but we hope for them to come back, but you also need outsiders to stimulate you.
There's a recent article on a magazine called Inc. It's a US-based magazine. It has a feature about immigrants, not about entrepreneurs. A swapping 30% of today's internet entrepreneurs in America are actually descendants or the current immigrants.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, I think you're so right about Taipei should be open and embracing and inclusive of newcomers, and otherwise we lose our advantage. Otherwise, I think we also lose our ambition of being adventurous.
Well, it's also, if you look at it biologically, in a biological system, the gene pool needs refreshing.
Exactly.
So this is another version of it. So it needs refreshing through ideas, initiative, capital, etc., etc.
I wanted to also get into the topic of education. You've traveled around the world. You've consulted different governments. Obviously, London or the UK is one of the most praised innovative and creative capital. What, in your own observation, is missing in today's education in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we have to say, of course, London and Britain has an advantage because they speak English. So there are a lot of things that are not so good about Britain. If they didn't speak English, if they spoke Icelandic in Britain, perhaps London wouldn't be such a hub. But nevertheless, there are some features about British education which people mention quite a lot, particularly postgraduate education.
I see.
Which is firstly that it's not a modularized system. It's more open.
Okay.
The learning is helping you fulfill yourself rather than saying, here is the things that you have to learn.
To get you the job or get you a pay raise.
It's about you self-realizing yourself.
That's right.
Now, the result of that makes you more independent and, in some senses, more capable. And I've interviewed quite a few people who've come from abroad to England, Germany, France, and they say the difference between the over-structured, rather theoretical learning that happens in some of their countries, which has its virtues, versus the more practice-oriented and you learning to learn approach and you learning to communicate approach of Britain is one main difference. There's also a cultural difference. In this work I did for the French government, there was a question that in France, people always ask you, what did you study? In Britain, they say, what can you do?
Exactly.
And it's a very different, it's only a word, but it's a completely different approach. So I don't know what you studied, but I think you can think. So I would say, work with me, yeah? But I don't even know what you studied, yeah? I know nothing about the people I collaborate with here. I have no idea what they studied.
Yeah.
And I've never asked them that question because all we're doing is trying to do a project. And that is certainly in some countries in the West a real problem. And I feel it's also a bit of a problem here because of the lack of mature partnerships between public, private and others. There's this sort of world as if the scholar here knows and you're the politician and your business. Whereas in a sense, it's this combined knowledge that would really be useful. So, I mean, my sense, people tell me that things are slightly rigid here. I can't prove it, but that's what people tell me. I mean, particularly I've read all the statistics about Taiwan being the place with the highest amount of peer-grouped reviewed articles per capita. But that isn't really saying whether these things are good or not in terms of the real world.
Yeah, if you look at the number of patents that are filed every year, I believe Taiwan is, number one or at least top 5 countries in the world. But I wonder what are, how comes this innovation capital has not been transformed into a real value? What's missing between somebody who's hashing out a invention in the lab than the real market solution and applications?
Well, that again comes to this point which has been a thread through all our conversation, which in a sense is these communication gaps. And I'm not saying it's that easy, but clearly there's these divided walls between groupings. And one divided wall I would like to discuss is the whole of our 3-year project was really about, acknowledging the potential that's here and working with it. But one of the gaps is that there are lots of older people in Taiwan who created the high-tech revolution who've got a lot to offer. But there seems to be a gap in communication between them and the under 35s, a 33-year-old person who might be starting up a company. There's a gap between the best of the old and the best of the young.
Yeah.
I don't see many mentoring programs or collaborations between the generations and so on. Because you can say to people, as we do, let's have a startup culture. But if you're 23, why should you know all these complicated things? I mean, it's very good to have people who help you along. Which is why I think that many of the innovations and creativity we see in Taipei and Taiwan is a bit like knickknacks, sort of little things that are sort of quite attractive, but haven't got any real substance, because doing that is much more complicated.
Absolutely.
Although I did see yesterday with Business Next a sort of long startup meeting with about 150 people, where clearly there is this bubbling up phenomenon, but it's, again, there's always the danger that it's just about pretty design.
Yeah, I think that's really addressing an issue of a bubble of, trying to start up a business, than actually understanding what it means to be cutting edge and creative. And I think most people take the concept of, doing something nice, doing something beautiful, it means to be innovative. And I think that's a real difference in that regard. And I also have interesting questions here that I think I wanted to really go into. It has a very interesting way of asking this question. It says, I'm going to translate it directly from Chinese. It said that Taipei City going from 1.0 to 3.0. How do they find a balance in economy, livelihood, and industrial development? And since the wages are so low now, how do we even think about creativity? We can't even feed ourselves. Probably not to the extent of starving, but I think we don't have a luxury of thinking creativity. And if you're talking about service design or service-related creativity, are we going to abandon what we call a 1.0 in manufacturing industry? What is that they're going to? I think there's two questions. How do we face the low wages and then still being creative, which I think doesn't collide with each other? And the second question is, should we abandon so-called 1.0
manufacturing? That is a very clear question. Yeah. The first question is the innovations that we require within the economy are those things that makes ideally Taipei prosperous, to give people higher wages because the products and services are exported. And this raises a point that the reason why we need to be open is because we have to globalize. Everybody has to be operating globally. So what we're really saying is, unless you allow this potential to come up, you can't revitalize the economic engine that is Taipei, that ultimately leads to higher wages and so on. So it's not a question, I've got low wages and therefore I can't be creative. It's, how can I be creative to help create businesses that give me higher wages? In relation to the second question, which was 1.0
manufacturing, industrials.
When I say 1, 2, 3, I don't mean saying get rid of one, because of course you need physical infrastructure and things like that. But you need to do it from a 3.0 perspective. So instead of just building, as we used to do in lots of countries, a road that just goes like a motorway through the middle of communities, you say, hey, just hold on a moment. What can make this community work best? Perhaps the road needs to be softened. Perhaps it shouldn't be 7 lanes, it should be 4 lanes or whatever. So I'm not getting rid of 1.0, I'm just saying it should be seen through the eyes of 3.0. And in terms of manufacturing, yes, we do want manufacturing, but we want obviously advanced manufacturing. So that's my view on that. I mean, I'm only using 1, 2, 3 as simplistic devices for us to sort of make an assessment. Are we thinking in the right sort of way?
I've actually gone through all these questions, but I think we have a few more minutes left. What I'd like to do for the rest of the time is for Charles to really ask questions to the people watching online, for them to think about. What are some of the questions that you have for the people watching online, or who will view this program later online to really take home with? What are some questions you want them to think about?
Yeah. Well, there are a series of questions. I mean, one question I would like to ask people is, what do you think you yourself lack in trying to make the most of your potential? Is it all to do with city governments and the operating environment, or is some of it to do with yourself? So what is your own self-criticism in a positive way? That's one question I would like to ask. The second question I'd like to ask is what people feel are the strongest assets in their place, which may be the whole of Taiwan or Taipei, and resources that can provide the most catalytic impact. What are these resources? What is it? Is it people? Is it stuff? Is it attitudes? Is it things in the ground? Is it connections? Whatever it is, what are your main resources? A third question I'm quite interested is, if you were someone who was in power, what would be the sort of main rules you would shift to make the most of the situation? What rules and regulations would you shift? So those are 3 questions I can think of for the moment.
Well, that's actually a lot for all of you to really think about. I don't know if you're a urban planner, a designer, or architect, or even a student or a household wife while watching online. I think these are the interesting questions to really think about. I guess we're really coming to an end of this interesting discussion. And lastly, I'm curious about your lifestyle, Charles. You've kind of a global traveler. I don't know. Sometimes when you wake up, which country, which city, which time zone you're at. Tell us how you balance your life. And one thing I noticed about Charles is he never lose his sense of humor. I don't know if that's his British gene or I don't know. I just love to learn about how you balance your how life and still, see a glimpse of humor in all the craziness that you witness around the world.
Well, firstly, it's always very stimulating to be in places where you're together doing the project. Because I'm learning, this is a learning process for me, learning about Taipei has been very enriching, and so I would like to thank Taipei for that opportunity. So, because the thing that's driving me is also that I want to learn, I'm then obviously stimulated by these types of experiences. The other thing is, I just have decided, and this is completely random, is I'm born on the 1st of July, and that is in the middle of the year. So I feel my role in life and my destiny, this is me just deciding it,
Always in between.
is to try to blend turning an idea into reality, trying to bring parties together, trying to facilitate. So that's another thing, what makes me feel okay. Thirdly, this is not a secret, but I live in the middle of nowhere, right? And that living in the middle of nowhere, I mean, there are only 20 houses, and I look out when I'm thinking about Taipei over sort of fields, is for me incredibly important. And that means that I'm really saying nature and the city actually are connected, but because my city is lots of cities, I need that other balance of the opposite of cityness. So that's important to me.
It's been a real pleasure to have you, Charles. Thank you so much for the wonderful gift that you give to Taipei.
Thank you, and thank you for the conversation. That's great. Thank you, Jason.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jason Hsu and creative genius, Charles Landry, and you're watching Creative City Platform Taipei, and let's change Taipei together. Thank you all for viewing online. We hope to see you next again. Bye-bye.